Okay. Hello, everyone. Thanks for spending your lunch with us today. My name is Brian Thomas, and in addition to being a 1L here, I'm also a direct service fellow with the Youth Advocacy Project. In her book, Burning Down the House, The End of the Juvenile Prison, journalist Nell Bernstein writes, quote, "These are the lessons that young people who are locked up learn. To close off their emotions, shut down their intellect, quell their individuality, avoid forming connections, and to view all interactions through the prism of power." Like its adult counterpart, the juvenile system has a wide web of practices that reinforce these outcomes. One extremely damaging practice that gets little attention, the imposition of fines and fees, is the topic of our panel today. We are pleased to welcome representatives of both the Juvenile Law Center here in Philadelphia, as well as the Policy Advocacy Clinic at Berkeley Law. Thank you to our panelists, as well as to TPEC for facilitating this week of programming. After introducing the panelists in just a moment, we'll invite the audience to engage in an anonymous poll to reflect on their own understanding of the juvenile justice system. Then, our panelists will share their thoughts on the issue, as well as their recent work towards abolishing juvenile fines and fees. Finally, we'll have a Q&A. First, some quick housekeeping notes. To submit a question virtually for those watching, please use the Q&A feature found on the ribbon at the bottom of the window. In-person attendees, please use the note cards that were handed out to write down any questions you have today. For those of you in the room with us, please make sure all your devices are silenced or on Do Not Disturb mode, and please refrain from eating your lunch indoors. We invite you to eat your lunch outside in the courtyard at the end of the event. We are recording this lecture, and it will be sent to everyone who is in attendance. If you are seeking CLE credit for today's event, please note that the CLE passwords will be announced twice per hour. Write down these passwords and enter them on your digital evaluation form once the event is over. The evaluation form is mandatory for both in-person and virtual attendees seeking credit in order to receive CLE. The link to the digital evaluation form was emailed to you in your confirmation email. If you did not receive this email, if you are on the webinar, please find the link to the evaluation form in the chat, or if you're here in person, you can scan the QR code at the door upon the conclusion of the event. These passwords will tell us how long you attended. The first passcode is strawberry, and that is spelled STRAWBERRY. So now, just a few words to introduce our panelists. First, our moderator, Kara Fink. Kara Fink directs the Interdisciplinary Child Advocacy Clinic at Penn Law, which brings together law and graduate-level social work students on client-centered legal teams to directly represent adolescents, children, and families, and to work on system-wide reform efforts. Prior to joining the Penn Law faculty, Professor Fink was the managing attorney of the family defense practice at the Bronx Defenders, where she created a groundbreaking interdisciplinary legal practice for parents involved in the child welfare system. Her specialty areas include child welfare, parents' rights, and interdisciplinary practice, focusing on law and social work collaboration. Jessica Fireman is Senior Managing Director at the Juvenile Law Center here in Philadelphia. In addition to overseeing JLC's projects and programs, she also engages in litigation, amicus efforts, and policy advocacy focused on juvenile and criminal justice reform. In collaboration with the Policy Advocacy Clinic at Berkeley Law and the National Center for Youth Law, Jessica leads a national effort to abolish fines and fees in the juvenile justice system. Jessica also co-teaches the Juvenile Justice Seminar here at Penn Law with JLC co-founder Marcia Levick. Prior to joining Juvenile Law Center, Jessica was a litigation fellow at the ACLU National Prison Project. Before that, she was a teaching fellow in the Georgetown University Law Center's Street Law in the Community program and clerked for the Honorable Warren J. Ferguson on the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Marcus Jarvis is the Outreach and Communications Associate for the Juvenile Law Center's Debt-Free Justice Campaign. He is also an alumnus of JLC's Youth Advocacy Program. When he was 19 years old, Marcus joined Juveniles for Justice to share his experience in the juvenile justice system and to further his advocacy work. In 2019, he received a Media Justice Fellowship with the People's Paper Co-op. He has done national outreach to youth and families on the impact and harm of juvenile fines and fees. Jeff Selbin directs the Berkeley Law Policy Advocacy Clinic, which he founded in 2015 as an interdisciplinary clinic to train and supervise law and public policy students to take on systemic, racial, and economic injustice. The Policy Advocacy Clinic, in collaboration with the Juvenile Law Center and the National Center for Youth Law, recently launched Debt-Free Justice, a national campaign to abolish juvenile fines and fees. Finally, Rachel Wallace. Rachel Wallace joined the Berkeley Law Policy Advocacy Clinic as a clinical teaching fellow after receiving a Master's of Public Policy degree from UC Berkeley's Goldman School of Public Policy in 2020. During her master's program, Rachel worked on debt-free justice projects throughout the southern United States. Her policy interests include carceral justice system funding and monetary sanctions, as well as the intersection of re-entry and civic engagement and voting rights. Her current work focuses on non-litigation strategies for abolishing racialized wealth extraction in the South, as well as pretrial issues and restitutions in California. So thank you to all of our panelists and Professor Fink for being here today. And I will now turn the event over to Professor Fink.
Okay, thank you so much, Brian. And welcome everyone. It is my real, true honor to be moderating this panel with experts who have such a deep experience in this system and particularly in the issues of debt-free justice. So as Brian mentioned, we're gonna start off with a poll to get a sense of what folks know about the juvenile justice system. So if you can go either on your phones, with your laptops, if you're joining us virtually, multitask for a good reason for this on your Zoom. In one word, what is the goal of the juvenile justice system? And we're going to start to get the word cloud coming up. And for those of you not familiar with word clouds, as more folks give the same one word, you're going to notice the word get bigger. And I think it's telling that the first word that came up and the one that is biggest, or perhaps are having a bit of a contest, is rehabilitation and punishment. And I have no doubt that those opposite spectrums and the reality will come out. Huh. Okay. And I think all answers have been recorded. So it's interesting, at least to me, and then we'll go on to the next question, the negativity of some of the words that are up there, of most of the words that are up there, and what that means for this system. Oh, we've got some last minute folks coming in here. Right, but the notion of future and resources are much smaller than punishment, subjugation, harms, imprisonment, violence, terrorize. And so it'll be interesting to hear our panelists discuss how that has been played out for them in the system. Can we go to the next question, Rachel? In what year did the US Supreme Court hold that juveniles have most of the same due process rights as adults? And if you have taken my colleague's class, hopefully you will know this. Jessica, did they get it right?
Well, we'll talk a little bit more about the, oh, I'm not on the mic. Turn on the thing. Okay, we'll talk a little bit more about the history of the juvenile justice system, but the key note here about due process rights, 1967 was the moment when the court really recognized that in court there are designated due process rights for kids.
Okay, so let's go to the next question. There we go. Courts may require youth and/or their parents to pay which of the following? Fees for a public defender, cost of prosecution, the cost of electronic monitoring, mental health treatment costs, or all of the above? I can't actually. We seem to have a resounding front runner. We may have stacked the question a bit, but E is exactly what we'll be talking about today. It is all of the above. And for those of you who came with that assumption or knowledge, really understanding how fees and fines have both changed the juvenile justice system and the impact they have on the lives of youth and families nationally, but for my purposes also here in Philadelphia, where there has been tremendous work done to have debt-free justice, is really the subject that we're going to dive into today. And what I would like to do is start, for those of you who this may not be something that you know a lot about, and to make sure that we all have a foundational grounding in what the system is about, really start with an understanding and overview of the juvenile justice system. In 2016, a group of advocates, youth advocates from Juvenile Law Center spoke to City Council about this very problem. And they actually wrote a poem, which I will not repeat because I will not do it justice in the reading, but called The Cost of Our Struggle. And they ended with the lines, "See, we are youth trying to gain knowledge and survive. We're just asking you, don't let these fees cost us our lives." Marcus, could you start us off today and maybe tell us a little bit about your experience with fines and fees and in the juvenile justice system?
Yep. Thanks for having me, everybody. It's good to not have to do so much of an intro. I can kind of get a little more straight into the story of it. So my initial experience with the court system or with fines and fees came from my I was certified as an adult for a drugs charge that I was convicted for when I was 16. I was sentenced to county prison. I did 11 and a half months in the county prison. So when I got out, I, started college. I got my GED when I was incarcerated. So I was, really looking forward to getting out and thinking that I was kind of like ahead in life. And I was like, I graduated before my entire, high school class. So I didn't feel like, like I was so much far behind. But then I went to get a driver's license. I went to, take my permit. And they told me, I couldn't take my permit until I paid this money that I owed. And But once I paid the money, I could start serving my license suspension. I was like, how could I have a license suspension? I never even drove. So I just walked out. I just left PennDOT, whatever. I just was like, all right, I just get an ID. And I left. I was just like, this is crazy. And I really kind of like paid that no mind for a while. I just went about, just trying to live life. I'm like, okay, I'll just catch the bus and like, I won't be getting a car. So I just moved about my life. And about a year or two later, I started working with JLC, and I was working at the Eagle Stadium. So I just started at Eagle Stadium, and I was going to Montgomery County Community College. And I was on my way to my first day of class, and I got stopped on like 16th and 6th to be more, just for walking down the street. And they were saying there was robberies in the area. I had on whatever I was wearing. They ran my name. They seen I had a warrant for, so they said I had a warrant. They said, so I had like some weed in my pocket, and they were like, we're not going to lock you up for this. We're just going to run your name, and we're not even going to worry about it. So I was like, okay, these people are cool. They're not even going to do anything. So they seen I had a warrant, and I didn't know what I had a warrant for. They didn't know what I had a warrant for. So they said, we got to take you in to find out what it is for. So I got taken in to my job, lose my job. I'm not able to start school. They take me to the CFCF, which is the county prison of Philadelphia. In a few days, I didn't find anything out in that day. A few days later, I went to a court, and they told me that Lackawanna County, which was the county jail that I had served a year in when I was 16, I owed them $1,300, and it was up to them whether they were going to come and get me or I was just going to get a court date to pay it off. So I thought I was just going to get out, and they ended up, Lackawanna County came to Philadelphia. 2 sheriff from Lackawanna County drove to Philadelphia to come and get me from, the county jail. They handcuffed and shackled me, drove me 3 hours, to Lackawanna County. Excuse me. I'm on a meeting, sir. I hear you. Yeah, sure. I'm gonna go upstairs. So I'm sorry about that. I'm having some work done in my house. It's actually falling apart as we speak. So as long as the roof doesn't cave in, I can continue. And so sorry about that. Yeah, so I got arrested. They took me to, I had to work in this program to pay off. Long story short, I had to work in this program to pay off the fines because I didn't have a charge or anything like that. I wasn't arrested for anything, but the judge gave me like an ultimatum in Lackawanna County. When I got there, it was like, you either pay the fines off today, which I obviously couldn't because I'm from Philadelphia. They just took me 3 hours away to Lackawanna County, and I don't have any family out there to just be able to show up at the court date. Nobody even knew where I was at or what was going on because I didn't have money on my books, and it cost $5 a phone call for you to even call Philadelphia from Lackawanna County. You would have had to have money to even be able to call in the first place. So at the court day, it was like $50 a night, and I think I'm gonna have to move them. Okay. Take it to the phone.
Yeah. So, Marcus, I hope this doesn't mean that you're Ruth felon. So I'm gonna give a second. I want to turn it over, and I think Jessica, can you give us perhaps a different overview of the history and structure of the juvenile legal system, and perhaps how we got to a point where a young person like Marcus is charged for their incarceration?
Sure. Well, it's hard I will give my best explanation, but when you hear stories like Marcus's, it's hard to come up with any kind of logical answer to what he was experiencing. And I think that was nicely reflected in the words that folks put into the word cloud. So the system was supposed to be created to be different from the adult system, in a way to be a kinder and gentler system. We'll unpack that a little bit. But the reality is that those tensions that people have put about, I can't remember all the words, terrorized, punishment, surveillance, race, it's been a problematic history from the beginning of the juvenile court. The picture on the left here with the three pictures side by side is actually a Teen Vogue article that goes into much more depth on the history of the juvenile legal system and specifically about problems of racial inequity that have persisted, that were built into the system from the beginning and have persisted. So if this is an area of interest to you, I would recommend that article. On the right, what you see is a 1908 juvenile court with the child coming up to the bench. And the court originated as sort of the origins of the court that we describe today as the juvenile court originated in Cook County, Illinois in 1899. And the sort of public version that has been told for many years about why it was created was to treat the need, not the deed. The idea that kids are different from adults, we're going to adjust for them. We don't want to penalize them for life. Instead, we want to sort of bring them around. And for those in the room who I recognize from my seminar, we talked about this a little bit. That original Juvenile Court Act had all kinds of very loaded words, a lot of talk about reputable citizens doing things, and a lot of language about really casting a wide net to bring kids into the juvenile court. So right from the get-go, there were problems. And of course, even before the court started, kids have been in the legal system. And if you go back as far as slavery and then to convict leasing, you'll see kids who were in convict leasing situations. And so we have deep structural racism at the heart of our system. And on top of that, we built a system that was supposed to be rehabilitative. Of course, the word rehabilitative itself is a loaded term, because if you're being rehabilitated, it presumes that there's something that you've done that requires an intervention. Oftentimes, that's not the case. We can go to the next slide. I think, Rachel, you've got the power. So the little pre-quiz on constitutionalization. In the 1960s, there was a series of cases, the most famous one probably In re Galt, and that's actually on the left, a picture of Galt from In re Galt, who made a prank phone call and got adjudicated delinquent without the presence of a lawyer and without a lot of other due process rights. He petitioned his case up to the US Supreme Court, and the court held that the condition of being a boy does not justify a kangaroo court. So the due process clause, neither the Constitution nor the due process clause are for children alone. At the same time, I want to sort of keep up this clarity about the parallel tracks of the juvenile justice system. This is a moment of a lot more due process protections. The picture on the right is a group of girls who were held in a stockade for civil rights protests. And they had been chanting and marching and singing, and they were locked up. And they were locked in this same building that you're looking at here for a number of days before their parents found them. And apologies to everyone for really bringing up a history and a reality that's tough, but that's our juvenile justice system. We can't talk about it without recognizing the deep level of harm. So even at this moment of constitutionalization, for some young people, others were facing really severe discrimination and harmful conditions. And we can go to the next slide. This is whipping through history here very quickly. So in the 1980s and 90s, there was a real, folks may have heard about the super predator era. So this myth that there were super predators out there, there was a rise in juvenile arrest rates at that time. And certain researchers hypothesized it's going up and it's just going to keep going up. So we need to be as tough on crime as possible. Again, the arrests, the characterizations, the media portrayal were very loaded along racial lines. So there was a portrayal of scary Black young men that was in the media mind, that was not based in reality, but that really did drive policy. And so we saw in that era a lot of laws passed to push young people into the adult system. or if they're in the juvenile system previously, the juvenile codes across the country really focused on rehabilitation. Now they started to explicitly add language around either punishment or accountability. So much harsher treatment of young people. And we're still dealing with the after effects of those laws today. And then we can click to the next one. So in 2005, a lot of people put 2005 as a key moment in the history of the juvenile legal system, and that is accurate. In 2005 was one of the first cases to really center the difference between young people and adults. The brain development differences were hinted at. The psychological research was discussed a little bit. And in the case of Roper v. Simmons, the US Supreme Court held the death penalty unconstitutional for kids. So that was both important, obviously, for keeping kids from facing the death penalty, the harshest punishment, but it also opened up a way of thinking and talking about the justice system. So from 2005 for the next, say, still today, I think it's fair to say, there have been a slew of cases at the US Supreme Court that have said kids are not the same. They're not just miniature adults. They're not the same as adults. And because of that, they deserve different and unique protections under the law. They can't get life without parole, mandatory life without parole. They need special protections during police interrogations. And juvenile justice systems also picked up on this notion that kids are different and that they're amenable to treatment in different ways. Again, that still centers the rehabilitation and amenability take. But it was a shift in the law that helped a lot of kids. At the same time, what we saw is the disparities did not shrink in the system. In fact, this new way of looking at the problem led over time to a significant decrease of the number of young people in juvenile justice systems in almost every state, but not a decrease in disparities and sometimes an increase in disparities. So it was an important moment, but it didn't get us where we need to get, which is an equitable system that actually treats young people fairly and appropriately. And so that has taken us to where we are from now. A few key notes, and it sounds like folks in the room, just based on the word cloud, know much of this. We're still seeing disparities at every stage. We see young people, not every young person in the juvenile system is taken from their family, but many are. That itself can be traumatic. Once they're in the system, we see harsh conditions, so solitary confinement, pepper spray, restraints, really terrible conditions that young people are facing. Many of them then, people assume that their records will be expunged because they're juvenile records. Most of the time that's not the case, or it doesn't happen automatically. We see still many young people pushed into the adult system. Thankfully that number is shrinking, but still significant, and still significant disparities in who's pushed into the system. And then finally, this issue around fines, fees, and restitution is something many of us have been working in this field for a long time and didn't recognize. That kids were also just getting charged money, and their families were getting charged money. So in 2016, we did some research, and I think the folks from PAC will talk more about this, but we looked across the country, and we found that every state except for New York, which only imposed restitution, every other state had some level of fees and fines. Many of them had all of the fees and fines that you saw on that list earlier. And so it was just one more way of pulling resources from families instead of putting them into families, and something that we're grateful to be able to chat with all of you about today.
So Jeff, to turn to some of the work that you've done in the policy advocacy clinic has done, could you talk a little bit about whether you have seen these issues nationally, from the ones that both Jessica and Marcus shared earlier, and what the response has been on a national level to this issue?
Yeah, of course. Thank you, Professor Fink. And thank you, Marcus and Jessica and Brian, for the kind introduction, and all the YAP students and everybody who attended. I wish we could be there with you in person. So as Jessica noted, and it's obviously the centerpiece of what we're talking about today, fines, fees, and restitution, which are up here on the screen, are three of the buckets of fees. They often get lumped together, but it's helpful to understand the distinctions. On the youth end, and Marcus can say more about this if he wants. On the youth end, they're often indistinguishable. You don't even know about them until you go and try to get a driver's license, or you get picked up on a warrant, or you just get a big bill that doesn't distinguish. But anyway, the three buckets we want to just make sure you're clear on are, first, these administrative charges, which were in the poll everywhere, for detention, supervision, public defenders, electronic monitoring. The list goes on and on. There are, in the 49 states that authorize these, there are dozens, if not hundreds, of different kinds of user fees, as they're often called, for folks in the system. Note, obviously, that people haven't chosen to partake of the system, so the whole concept of user fees is inapt. Fines, on the other hand, are in theory to punish youth for any offenses for which they've been adjudicated delinquent. I threw up a couple of examples here, things like graffiti, truancy, for example. But those are supposed to be punitive, and then restitution, as I think you all know, is supposed to be restorative in some way. That is, it's and there's lots of different terminology, and as Jessica and Professor Fink have suggested, and as your own word cloud suggests, a lot of them are problematic, but making the person who was the victim of the crime whole. So those are the three pieces. Rachel, can you take? So these are again, in general, the three kinds of problems that we have seen nationally from the imposition of fines, fees, and restitution on youth and families. The first one is the harm, and again, I can't say it better than what Marcus has already described, but these monetary sanctions impose high economic and social strain on families. They're incredibly racially discriminatory, both in their application and in their impact. And we can answer more questions about that or talk about it. But there's now some studies that have been done, most of them in conjunction with Juvenile Law Center and others in our community. But it's clear that these are a big problem for youth and families. They don't, it turns out, and this is what we're calling costly here, it turns out they don't actually generate much revenue for government. In fact, in some places it's negative revenue. And I'll just give you a couple of examples. In Louisiana, where we've worked for the last 4 years, the state spends about $1.15 for every dollar it generates from juvenile fees and fines. The Oregon Youth Authority, which charges quote unquote child support to the parents and guardians of youth incarcerated by the state, spent $866,000 last year to collect $864,000 from youth. So basically, governments are just taking money from vulnerable youth and families and using it to chase other vulnerable youth and families. There's no net revenue in most places. And finally, a lot of these practices are unlawful. I think Jessica may touch on this a bit later, and we're happy to answer questions. They can violate state law. They can violate federal law in their application. They can also violate constitutional due process, equal protection, and other provisions. The next slide. I'm going to give you a quick, this is to sort of map on a little bit to Jessica's history, but to start during your lifetime, I guess, in 2009. I will say this is just a very modern iteration. That it really starts, the modern era of juvenile fines and fees really starts in the late 60s and early 1970s with the confluence of the wars on crime and drugs and the tax revolt, which result both in lots more people being punished and incarcerated and a lot less money to cover those expenses. So governments turn to charging youth and adults for their involvement in the system. That's all part of a much longer history. Jessica touched on it, that goes back through Jim Crow, the Black Codes, convict leasing, all the way to chattel slavery. I think it's important to know that history because it explains in part what we're up against in trying to get rid of fines and fees today. But anyway, up to the very kind of modern era, in 2009, And it's no coincidence that I'm starting it in 2009. This is right after the economic recession, where at least in California, and I think it's true in many places that where we have data, counties and state governments double down, in the case of many counties of California, tenfold increases in fines and fees imposed on youth to try to generate revenue. It was a real economic crisis, especially for state and local government. In LA, what happened was the Youth Justice Coalition, and I think it's also significant that youth were at the kind of vanguard of identifying the problem. The Youth Justice Coalition issued a report called Getting Paid, which was about detention fees in Los Angeles, which were incredibly onerous. Actually, the LA Times picked it up, and the Board of Supervisors fairly quickly put a moratorium in 2009 on juvenile detention fees. It didn't get a lot of attention, even in California, much less nationally. In 2014, when Michael Brown was murdered in Ferguson, and the subsequent DOJ investigation revealed that police and courts were being used just essentially as a racist revenue racket to stop people for very minor, ridiculous things, charge them high fees, squeeze every last penny out of them. The issue generally burst onto the national scene. The Juvenile Law Center in 2016, Jessica referred to this, then issued a critical report, the foundational report called Debtors' Prisons for Kids. At the same time, we had started in our own clinic in 2012, 2013, working on this issue locally. And so we issued a couple of reports, one of which I think you all saw. A local one in Alameda County in 2016 and a statewide one in 2017. So those are kind of the moment when reform starts to happen in a more national way. Again, the Penn folks should talk more about the Philadelphia experience, which was also going on at the same time. In 2017, California passed the first legislation nationally to abolish all fees in the system. A couple of years later, passed a bill that actually then got rid of all of the outstanding fees. You'll note under the 2018 bucket that California youth and families owed about $360 million. That's what was outstanding when the legislature passed Senate Bill 1290 in 2020. So we're talking about huge sums of money, again, typically owed by vulnerable families. In 2021, and Rachel, I think will tell you a lot more about all of this, we formally launched the Debt-Free Justice Campaign, which you've heard reference to. The goal of the campaign is to end all fines and fees for youth and families. And as it notes here, we've had some success in states. And again, Rachel will, I think, touch on all that with a map and other info. Anyway, again, thanks again for having us here.
So Rachel, perhaps you can share with us now, knowing as we just heard that these fines and fees are harmful, costly, and illegal, what are some of the state and federal efforts underway to abolish these fines and fees in the juvenile justice system?
I was so focused on the slides, I didn't unmute myself. So yeah, sure, I can definitely talk about some of the state and local work. Jeff teed up a lot of this with the California efforts that kind of started before the launch of the campaign. I have a slide here just for a little bit more context about the campaign, just as a little background before I get into where we're working. So we work on policy advocacy issues. So that's really like the legislation at the statewide level, as well as local advocacy, litigation, which Jessica will talk about later, I think, and then engaging communities. And those are not like in priority order. I think, one thing that's been important for the campaign is engaging communities throughout all of the work. So that really is overarching with the other issues we work on. But in terms of where we've been working, this is a map that is updated now. So this is where we have seen action being taken through the last several years. This has been we've been working on this with JLC and Nickel. So the gray states are the states where we are not in. So you'll see, well, we are in some of them now, but where there hasn't been action in terms of a bill that was either filed in 2021 or a locality that passed reform or a state that had successful legislation. So you can see most states are accounted for. Several others, when I look at this map, are going to have bills in 2022. So this map will be a lot more colorful in like 2 months, which is very exciting. As I mentioned, or as was mentioned in my introduction, I work a lot in the South. So you'll see the South is almost completely colored in, which is very exciting for me. So I guess I'll just highlight kind of some of the ones that were successful in this past session. So Texas, Louisiana, Virginia, Colorado, New Mexico, and Oregon had successful legislation in 2021 that JLC and our clinic had worked on in various states. And so some of those states repealed all juvenile fees and fines, some repealed partial, and will be returning in future sessions to kind of get the rest of the fees and fines. Some were retroactive. I think when we think about like gold standard legislation, we like to see bills that repeal all the fees and fines and are retroactive. So especially because with the engaging communities piece, we're often having families and youth testify in hearings, and if the bills are not retroactive, then their debt is not forgiven, and then they're not really benefiting from that labor and the stories that they're telling. So those are just some of the highlights of the ones that we've seen in this past year. In the South, I'll just use that as an example for like navy blue ones. So those are localities that passed reform, and what that means is kind of local advocacy where the state hasn't seen legislation either introduced or successful, or it's like in progress, but a particular court, or like in Hawaii as a prosecutor's office, might enact a policy to do what they can. So what that means is, like, for example, in Tennessee, where we've been working with courts there to eliminate the discretionary fees and fines. Many of them are mandated in state law in Tennessee, so they can't just stop assessing them at the court level, even if the judges wanted to get on board with the policy. So we help them identify which ones are discretionary and then help craft a policy to eliminate those. And that obviously provides immediate relief to the families in the locality, which is the first priority. But it's also a way for us to kind of gain allies when approaching the state legislature, and examples of what the policy could actually look like statewide. So yes, this is a pretty map. It's also on the website for the campaign, which I would encourage people to spend some time going through because it's really pretty and useful, and stepfreejustice.org. But you can go through, and the map on the website is interactive. So it's this map, but interactive. So if you were to hover over the states, you can see what's happening in each one. So yeah. And then I think that was it for mine.
Thanks so much, Rachel. And before we turn it over back again to Jessica to talk about some of the litigation and legal strategies that have been used to really contest the assessment and imposition of fines and fees, just a reminder, if you have questions, to start to think about them. We will be passing around note cards if they haven't already gone out. And if you are joining us by Zoom, you can put your question into the Q&A function on Zoom, and so that we're hoping to spend the remaining sort of 15 minutes of the presentation answering your questions about the work. But Jessica, let me turn it to you to give us a better sense of what are the legal challenges that are currently underway or that are being considered to really get rid of fines and fees.
Thank you. So what I will say is that there have been a number of times when we were about to make a legal challenge in court and we realized we could change the policy and get rid of all the fees instead. So we have a lot of theories about how you might challenge fees and fines, and there have been some cases, but the bulk of the work has been legislative, and that's sort of a useful thing to think about for those of you who are generally interested in public interest laws. What's the strategy that will get the most? I feel very grateful at Juvenile Law Center to work at an organization that is open to using policy advocacy, strategic communications, litigation, all of that. So anyway, that was just my little pre-statement about the litigation, which is there hasn't been that much of it because the policy work is moving so quickly, and we're very excited about that. A couple of things that were arguments that could be made. First of all, we talked about those 2005 cases that resulted in this notion that kids deserve special protection under the law. that's sort of an underlying theory that will apply to any of these other legal theories we make. I'll try to do these quickly so that we have time for questions. So one of the things that we see is that kids will be appointed counsel, and then their parents will be asked to reimburse the cost of counsel. So the argument that we have there is that's a really chilling approach to counsel. A parent, excuse me, that may then counsel a kid, I can't afford this, you can't get a lawyer. The kid then says, I'll appear without a lawyer. And then you really don't have the procedural protections that Galt required. Another argument, excuse me, is that a fine or fee is so disproportionate as to be excessive under the 8th Amendment. This is the one we were about to do in New Jersey, that they're mandatory fines. How can a kid pay a fine? Everything's out of whack in your balancing test. Then New Jersey got rid of all the fines, much better solution. There have been cases that a fee imposes an unfair taxation in violation of equal protection. So you're putting the burden of the justice system on one kid or one family or a group of families. This is actually a shared cost. Another line of cases is about what happens if you don't pay. If you don't pay, the original cases are adult cases. If you can't pay and then you get locked up, that violates due process. It's unconstitutional. So what might that look like for kids? Do you have to be locked up for it to violate the Constitution, or are there some other negative consequences that would also be unconstitutional? And then finally, there have been some cases, and I think Pac might be able to talk about this a little bit more, where the state law didn't permit the fine or fee to be collected, and it was collected anyway. So there's a slew of legal challenges. One of the things that we got in 2016 was guidance from the Department of Justice laying out some of these arguments. And then that guidance, which would inform local jurisdictions, this is how you need to act. You can't collect these, or you have to be very cautious about collecting fees from kids and families. The guidance was out, the advisory was out there for a month or two, and then the administration switched, and Jeff Sessions rescinded that guidance, and so we are now pushing. There's another opportunity, and we're hopeful that DOJ will issue new guidance. So some of these legal theories, one way to have them help you is through a lawsuit. Another way to have them help you is through DOJ guidance. So keep fingers crossed for that. And I'll pass it back to you.
There you go, and there's water. Thank you, Jessica. So one of the things that I think we want to talk to, and Jeff and Rachel, I don't know if you want to speak briefly, this issue about when the fee exceeds the authority granted under state law, how you've seen that and how you've responded. If you want to talk about that before we move into the Q&A quickly.
I'm happy to just provide some quick examples. There are a couple in particular in California. Mostly what we've seen is fees that are authorized in the adult system, but not in the juvenile system, that are being charged in the juvenile system. So for example, an investigation fee in California, $1,500 that could be charged in the adult system, just migrated, like almost everything else bad, from the adult system into the juvenile system. And so we brought that to the attention of the counties that were doing it. In Colorado charged also $1,500 drug surcharge to youth, not authorized by state law. This was in Larimer County, Colorado, Fort Collins. Again, brought it to the attention of the authorities, and it stopped, and actually, hopefully they've reimbursed folks to whom they charged it. That's an example. There are also all kinds of places where a basic ability to pay procedures are not followed as required by law. In one California county, the county was charging youth and families when the kid was adjudicated not delinquent, so found not guilty, essentially. That particular county, Contra Costa County, which is just north of us, the big city is Richmond, actually went back in their records and contacted hundreds of families and reimbursed hundreds of thousands of dollars. Not only did they stop charging it, they reimbursed families hundreds of thousands of dollars who had been unlawfully assessed. So anyway, those are some quick examples of the kind of things where the authority to charge the fees has been exceeded. And it's usually, I think, due to inattention. I mean, or it's the same probation office or collection office and judges, and they're just not paying attention to what's authorized for youth versus adults. Rachel, I don't know if you had other examples from states you've worked in.
Yeah, the similar things. I think one other example, and it's kind of going to your point, it's often like about inattention or these fee schedules where their listing fees have been passed down from a previous judge, or they've been using the same one for a really long time. And so they're not really auditing their own fee schedules. So sometimes when we do work with a locality, we'll find like an issue in their fee schedule. And like one example was literally a typo. So there was a fee that was authorized in state law that was $150, and their fee schedule said $510 because they switched it was just typos. It said $510. So that's a huge difference, obviously, in the amount of the fee. We're still trying to figure out if they were actually charging $510 to families, and I will mention, like Jeff said, like usually when we raise these issues through our research, it's not like people are like, okay, well, sue us then. They usually just fix it because it's usually something that they didn't know was happening, or they weren't keeping up with most recent law or auditing their own fee schedule. So that's probably what will happen in that case, is that if they were charging, they've committed like, oh, we'll fix that. Of course, we'll refund families. But those things can happen too when we're doing research in a locality or a state where we just find administrative errors, but those have huge impacts on families. So that's just one other example of like an unlawful fee practice. Again, we haven't had to pass it on. I said like I pass it on because I'm not a lawyer. Pass it on for litigation, but it's still something that could be litigated on if the jurisdictions didn't respond proactively when they were brought the issue.
Thank you so much, Jeff and Rachel, for clarifying that. And I'm horrified, although I guess happy that Contra Costa reimbursed folks. That is really a sort of telling example of how this is such a hidden problem, but so indicative of the larger issues. And so I will take moderators' ability to ask the first question to the panel. And Marcus, if you want to start us off in this discussion, I'd love to get your perspective on, when thinking about the issues in the juvenile justice system, how do you make such a broad-scale change in a system which I think we can all look at now and say is not living up to its perhaps original intention to support youth, if that indeed was its original intention, which I think is up for appropriate debate, but let's assume that. How do you make broad-scale change while simultaneously advocating for specific and more perhaps limited reforms, in this case using fines and fees as an example of this? How do you see that best working, and what do you hope for the future as we think about reforming the juvenile justice system, or perhaps even abolishing the juvenile justice system, to throw that out as well? Marcus, do you mind starting us off? Oh no.
Am I coming now?
We can hear you.
Yeah, sorry about that. So me personally, I would say like the main thing about this problem itself is like the awareness of like people knowing that it's a problem. Because like the average person, if you have a good upbringing, you expect the juvenile justice system and the prison system to be doing what they're supposed to do. People don't really know, the intricacies of what happens to a person, a juvenile that gets charged these fines, and what happens to that their family gets it, unless you're like a parent or you have a family member or something that this happens to. This is what usually makes a person an advocate or wants to, help change the issue, when they actually hear about what is happening. Usually people just expect the system to, like the juvenile justice system is supposed to be different than the adult system. The adult system is supposed to be, not be. The big point of it is like the most marginalized and small communities who don't have a voice are the people who are affected. So everybody else just kind of walks around. You're going to work. You're going to work, you're coming home, you're going to school, you're coming home. You're not bothered by this. Why should you, interact or even try to make this a how would you even know if nobody told you about this? Because you're going about your life doing what you're supposed to do. It's nothing wrong with a person, you know, doing the right thing and not knowing about this. It's actually great that there's a certain level of people that don't know about this. It's just a testament to how foul it is, because it only affects a certain type of person, a non-collegiate person that doesn't, you know, the average person that goes to a college doesn't experience these type of things in a way that, you know, a person in an urban community or even just poor. And it's not always really a racial thing. It's really a class thing to me. Like it's not just, you know, always just that there is marginalizing people because of race. It's really a class thing, because if you're a white poor kid, you're going to get treated the same way a black poor kid would get treated, especially because you're going to be in like Kensington. It doesn't matter what your race is, if you're in that area, you're going to get profiled, you're liable to get stopped or get some type of fine just because of the area that you're in, regardless of who you are, because of your economic status. And that's what it really comes down to. I feel like when people understand that, they have a bigger, you know, I had a post on Facebook where it was like, it was just saying that in fines and fees, period. And a lot of people had like really bad reactions to it. And I looked at it and it was like, the first thing you could say is like, wow, people aren't supporting this, you know, this cause. But when I looked at it a little closer, it's like, it said, it was broad. It didn't say juvenile fines and fees. When you talk about juveniles and people who don't have responsibility, who can't make any money, it gives a much different look to the problem itself, because I felt the same way about adults, but I just feel like it's very clear when we talk about juveniles not being able to make any money and then being asked to pay money. It's very ridiculous when a person tries to conceptualize it. So I think sharing awareness is really like the main thing, getting it in front of as many people as possible, you know, just getting the problem itself in front of as many people who don't understand that it's a problem.
Thank you, Marcus. And I think you actually teed up a question that has come in about comparisons and overlap with the adult system, but I want to give our other panelists a chance to respond to the broad scale change if they would like to. Go ahead, Jessica.
So one of the ways that I like to think about it is we need it all. So we have to have a big and visionary concept of how we want young people to be treated, and that's our ultimate goal. But when I talk to young people who have been system involved, they constantly remind me, don't put all your eggs in that basket, because right now I'm locked up and I'm facing solitary confinement. Right now I have a fee or a fine that I have to deal with. And so I think that we can both start by limiting harm. Where are the harms being imposed on kids the most? Let's start attacking those, and that's where legal tools can be really handy. We can file lawsuits, we can try to change laws. Then we can also try to shrink the footprint. We have a bigger so-called justice system in this country than anywhere in the world. We're locking up more people, and we do the same to kids. We're much more punitive. So we can try to shrink that system so that fewer kids are touching it. And then again, we can work towards the longer goal. So that's a little bit abstract, but I think if we just do an all of the above strategy, that'll be helpful. And one of the things that's nice about the fees and fines reform that you saw from Rachel's map is that it gets bipartisan support, it gets done. Berkeley has really taken a leadership role in showing us how to get state level change across the country in different kinds of political climates. So we might as well just jump on that and try to get it done now.
Thank you, Jessica. I want to turn now to this question that I think is in a lot of the questions that we've gotten from the audience members about what is the overlap with the adult criminal system and fines and fees in that system. We had a student or participant in the audience today who helped lead the Delaware campaign to end debtors' prisons, and other folks asked questions. How are you able to sort of either leverage the work you're doing in the juvenile system to, again, abolish fees and fines in the adult system? How do they perhaps help each other? How might they impede each other? what have been the conversations in that space from a policy perspective? And I'm going to turn to Rachel and Jeff for this question.
I can maybe start on this one because I have a lot of thoughts on it. So there's a couple things here. So I will say, I mentioned before, like our gold standard legislation that we'd like to see everywhere. One thing I forgot to mention there is that we are trying to push for bills that eliminate fees and fines to apply to youth who are tried as adults. We know that those are disproportionately Black, Latinx, and Indigenous youth, depending on kind of what state you're in. Like, for example, in Tennessee, in a county that I'm working in there, I think it was like every kid who was transferred to adult court last year was a Black youth. So despite not every child in that city being Black. So, we do try to have the legislation apply to youth as tried as adults, and what that looks like in practice is basically in the bill putting a paragraph, a really long paragraph, like all of these adult fees and fines do not apply to a juvenile, however we define it in the legislation. So that's one area that it could start to get into adult fees and fines, but certainly beyond, just the youth bills, there has been, Jeff can probably talk about California a little bit more, but certainly in places where we've worked with partners on youth fees and fines legislation, now they're like, okay, what about adults? And so there has been momentum that this work has allowed us to do. One thing I'll flag is like an ongoing challenge, because Jessica mentioned in the litigation or the legal challenges slide, like the children are different. Framing can be useful for litigation, but kind of not for trying to use the youth fees and fines work as momentum for getting rid of adult fees and fines, because then you're legitimizing the need for adult fees and fines. And that's touchy messaging. It's useful actually politically in a lot of places where we might, like I work in a lot of conservative states, like super conservative legislatures that are responsive to like children are different kind of thing. Like even the tough on crime states, they'll be like, oh, but these are kids. So it is useful for getting bills passed, but we have to be considerate of any unintended consequences we might have when using that. So that's just something I'll also note here. Depending on the jurisdiction, that can be kind of problematic when community groups go back and try to get rid of adult fees and fines. And the last thing I'll say before maybe Jeff, you can talk about the California adult work, is that in a lot of places we try to get data. This is impossible in most places. We try to get data on youth fees and fines, and sometimes we will also just ask for all the adult data, and that can be helpful for partners who might in the state who might want to work on this issue beyond the youth issue. So we can kind of use our work to try and get some information for them they can use for future campaigns in the adult system. But I'll turn it to Jeff for the California adult fees context.
Thanks, Rachel. Just really quickly, we from the beginning with the work in the juvenile system in California, in conversation with partners, we were really careful to try to not do what Rachel was talking about, which was throw adults under the bus. I don't think that's what Jessica's referring to in terms of litigation strategies, and Juvenile Law Center Nickel have also been great about this, notwithstanding their focus on youth. But we've just tried in all of our framing not to distinguish this as something that's okay in the adult system. We also, in the first bill that passed in California, SB 190, in 2017, it abolished fees actually up to age 21 in the adult system. It was a little Trojan horse that was in the bill that we didn't think would survive, but it did. And we have since worked on adult fees in California. A couple of years ago, the governor signed, actually just a year ago, September, the governor signed the first budget bill, which eliminated 23 fees on the adult side, the most onerous ones. 23 out of like 90 something. So just to give you a sense, but that bill requires discharge. I told you on the juvenile side, it was $360 million. For those 23 fees alone on the adult side in California, it's $15.9 billion, billion with a B, that's going to be discharged. This last September, so just a couple months ago, the governor signed a second budget bill that got rid of another 16 fees. Those are going to result in the discharge of $534 million in outstanding fees. There's still several dozen to go. But the reforms are migrating from the juvenile system to the adult system. And in the next year or so, I expect there will be a national campaign launched by colleagues and other organizations that are focused on the adult side to do very much the same. So that's that's very, very encouraging, because we should be clear, it's the same families. By the way, with restitution, and Rachel did mention, she's been organizing with Juvenile Law Center and others the first national convening on juvenile restitution, which is happening tomorrow and Friday, I believe. And same thing with restitution, that often the people who are the victims of crimes and those who do the harm are in the same families, communities. So we have to, and maybe this goes back to your first question, Professor Fink. I think we just need a more holistic approach that is about resources, much more about getting resources into communities and much less about, the punitive approach, from my perspective.
Thank you so much for that perspective. And I want to add, for those of us joining for CLE credit, your second code is CHERRY, CHERRY. Again, your second code is CHERRY. Moving on. Okay. So what I want to end with, and I apologize to all the thoughtful questions that we received, that we're not going to be able to get to all of them. These folks are available. There is work to be done. There is no shortage of advocacy efforts to get involved with, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. But I want to sort of throw out that it is important to think about, as some of you asked, how can you work with the bench to have different types of bench books, and working with judges, if there is discretion, how they exercise discretion, working with community organizations, and also thinking about whether there is litigation that can address the clear discrimination that happens in these systems, both the juvenile justice and the imposition of fines and fees. So we won't have time in our remaining 4 minutes to properly address those issues, but that is not a reflection of the importance of those issues. So what I would like to end with is to talk with all the panelists to share how can the students and the folks in the audience really get involved to help with this debt-free justice campaign and these reforms. So I don't know if Jeff and Rachel, you want to start us off, and then we'll switch to Jessica and Marcus.
I'll just say really quickly, take Professor Fink's clinic, take Professor Fireman's class, join the Youth Advocacy Project. I think that's the way to get plugged in most directly in the communities you're in. Feel free to reach out to us with any questions about how we can support, but that's how I encourage people to get involved, is locally, to learn the issues at the ground level and work with like-minded people.
Yeah, one thing I'll also just add to that is, we realize that students at Penn Law aren't just from like Philly. There's from all over the world. And so I think just connecting with the different campaigns going on in maybe your home state, if you're of interest. I know that like some of the Berkeley law students, same thing, are from everywhere. And a lot of times students who even aren't in our clinic will reach out asking about the work we're doing in their home state. So I think that's a good way to get involved. And I think if that is you, then I think just emailing, I'll put the contacts back up on the slides, but I think just emailing us, I'm happy to also take those emails and funnel to the right person, because it's not abundantly clear who exactly is working on each state on the public website. But yeah, I think that's a way to get involved if you are interested in like a different state as well.
Thanks for that question. Thanks, Jeff, for your for your plugs. The only thing I would add is, we're right nearby, and we do have internships and externships. So if someone is interested in working on this more, or more generally on juvenile justice issues, reach out to me or reach out to Professor Fink, and we can figure out how to do that. I think our spring intern and externships are not yet filled, so there's a sort of a process up on our website that you can follow. I think it's rolling, but the sooner the better. Summer internships, same thing. And there was another piece of that. I don't know what it was. Oh, I know what it is that perhaps you have some public interest hours to fill, but you don't want to do a whole internship or externship also feel free to reach out about that, because we sometimes have discrete tasks that we need help on.
And Marcus, can I ask you to close us out? What would you like to leave all of the audience members with as they go forward and think about these issues?
I think you guys have you guys play a big role in the future that we're all gonna live in, and the decisions that you make, make a big difference. The people you choose to help or not help will make a big difference in their lives. Everybody, including me, everybody in this room, I'm here virtually, but everybody there has a lot of power to change a lot of lives. I hope you guys, understand it and use it, because you have it.
Thank you so much, Marcus. I want to thank Marcus, Professor Selbin, Rachel, Professor Fearman, am I allowed to say professor? Yes. And everyone who has been so thoughtful in your questions and coming today, both on the Zoom and in the audience today, and really encourage all of you to reach out. This is an incredibly collegial, as you hopefully know, as T-Pickles and in the public interest community. Everyone is so happy to hear from students, to get involved with the work, to understand these issues in a deeper, more nuanced way, and to work not only with advocates working on this, but with community members as well. So please reach out. Don't be a stranger to anyone on the panel. And a round of applause for our in-person panelists and our virtual panelists. And Rachel and Jeff, thank you for joining us early in the morning from the West Coast. So thanks, everybody. Enjoy the rest of your day and reach out.
Urge to just